The story of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei cannot be separated from the story of modern Iran itself. For more than 3 decades, he has stood at the center of one of the most complex and controversial political systems in the world, shaping the direction of a nation that sits at the crossroads of the Middle East, global energy markets, and ideological conflict. To understand him is to understand the Islamic Republic of Iran, its origins, its ambitions, its fears, and its long confrontation with the West. Ali Khamenei was born in 1939 in the holy city of Mashhad, a center of Shia scholarship and religious devotion. His father was a cleric, and from an early age Khamenei was immersed in religious education. He studied Islamic jurisprudence and theology, eventually traveling to the seminaries of Qom, where revolutionary ideas were quietly forming beneath the surface of the Shah's secular monarchy. It was there that he came under the influence of Ruhollah Khomeini, the cleric who would later lead one of the most significant revolutions of the 20th century at the time. Iran was ruled by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, who maintained close ties with the United States and pursued rapid modernization. While cities expanded and oil revenues increased, many religious conservatives viewed the Shah's reforms as westernization that threatened Islamic identity. Political dissent was suppressed by SAVAK, the Shah's intelligence service, and opposition voices were jailed or exiled. Khomeini became part of the underground network of clerics and activists who opposed the monarchy. He was arrested multiple times during the 1960s and 1970s, spending periods in prison and internal exile. The revolution of 1979 transformed Iran and the trajectory of Khomenei's life. Mass protests, economic dissatisfaction, and religious mobilization culminated in the fall of the Shah. Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile and established the Islamic Republic, a political system unlike any other, a hybrid of republican institutions and clerical oversight. The principle of velayat-e faqih, or guardianship of the Islamic jurist, became the foundation of the new state. Under this doctrine, a senior cleric would hold ultimate authority to ensure that governance remained aligned with Islamic principles. Khomeini quickly rose within this revolutionary structure. He was elected president in 1981 during a period of extreme instability. Just months earlier, the country had entered a devastating war with Iraq under Saddam Hussein. The Iran-Iraq War would last 8 years, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives and reshaping Iran's military and political institutions. As President Khomeini operated alongside Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi, while ultimate authority remained with Khomeini, the war years hardened the leadership's worldview. Surrounded by hostile neighbors and backed by Western powers supporting Iraq, Iran's leadership developed a deep distrust of foreign intervention. In 1989, when Khomeini died, the Islamic Republic faced a defining moment. The Assembly of Experts selected Khomeini as the new supreme leader. At the time, some questioned whether he possessed the religious credentials traditionally expected for such a position. Yet political consensus and institutional survival required continuity. Over time, Khomeini consolidated authority, overseeing constitutional revisions that strengthened the office of Supreme Leader. As Supreme Leader, Khomeini controls the armed forces, appoints the head of the judiciary, influences state media, and holds final say over key national decisions. While Iran has elected presidents and parliamentarians, ultimate power rests with him. His leadership has been defined by 3 core priorities: preservation of the Islamic Republic, resistance to Western pressure, and expansion of Iran's regional influence. Relations with the United States have been central to Khomeini's worldview. The 1979 hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran cemented decades of hostility. Economic sanctions have shaped Iran's economy for much of his tenure. Khomeini views this foreign policy as interventionist and destabilizing in the Middle East. From his perspective, resistance is both ideological and strategic. He has frequently emphasized the concept of resistance economy, encouraging domestic production and reduced reliance on foreign imports to counter sanctions. Under his leadership, Iran expanded its regional footprint. Support for non-state actors and allied governments became a pillar of strategy. In Lebanon, ties with Hezbollah deepened. In Syria, Iran backed President Bashar al-Assad during the civil war. In Iraq, Iranian influence grew after the 2003 U.S. invasion. In Yemen, Iran was accused of supporting the Houthi movement. These actions positioned Iran as a central player in regional geopolitics, while also intensifying confrontation with rivals such as Saudi Arabia and Israel. The nuclear issue became one of the most significant challenges of Khomeini's leadership. Western governments accused Iran of pursuing nuclear weapons capability, while Iranian officials insisted the program was for peaceful energy purposes. Years of negotiations culminated in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the Iran Nuclear Deal. The agreement, negotiated between Iran and world powers including the United States, imposed limits on Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Khomeini supported the negotiations cautiously, balancing hardline skepticism with pragmatic acceptance. However, in 2018, the United States withdrew from the agreement and reinstated sanctions, escalating tensions once again. Domestically, Khomeini's tenure has not been without unrest. Iran has experienced waves of protests over economic hardship, political restrictions, and social freedoms. The Green Movement protests of 2009 followed disputed presidential elections. More recent demonstrations have focused on economic grievances and women's rights. Each time, the state responded with a combination of security measures and limited reforms. For Khomeini, stability and regime survival remain paramount. He often frames internal dissent as influenced by foreign adversaries seeking to weaken Iran. Economically, Iran faces structural challenges. Sanctions limit oil exports and access to global financial systems. Inflation and unemployment have strained public confidence. Yet despite pressure, the Islamic Republic has endured. Khomeini supporters argue that resilience under sanctions demonstrates the strength of the revolutionary system. Critics contend that economic isolation has reduced living standards and limited opportunities for younger generations. Ideologically, Khomeini positions himself as both a religious authority and political strategist. His speeches emphasize Islamic unity, resistance to oppression, and cultural preservation. He frequently warns against Western cultural influence, describing it as a threat to Islamic identity. At the same time, he supports scientific advancement and technological development within Iran, including missile and space programs, as symbols of national sovereignty. The question that often arises is how history will judge him. Supporters view him as a guardian who preserved the revolution against external threats. Critics see him as a leader who restricted political freedoms and entrenched authoritarian structures. Internationally, he is perceived either as a strategic mastermind expanding Iran's influence or as a destabilizing force in an already volatile region. As Ayatollah Khamenei advances in age, questions about succession loom. The structure he oversees must eventually transition to new leadership. How that transition unfolds could significantly impact Iran's future direction, whether toward continuity, reform, or internal struggle. The documentary of Ayatollah Khamenei is ultimately a story about power, ideology, survival, and resistance. It is about how a revolutionary cleric rose from prison cells under the Shah to become one of the most influential figures in the Middle East. It is about how ideology and geopolitics intertwine, and it is about how one leader's worldview can shape the destiny of a nation for decades. When Ayatollah Ali Khamenei became supreme leader in 1989, many observers believed he would be a transitional figure. He did not possess the same towering religious authority as Ruhollah Khomeini, and at the time of his selection, some senior clerics were considered more qualified from a traditional theological perspective. Yet over the decades that followed, Khomeini did not merely preserve the position he inherited, he reshaped it, strengthened it, and embedded it deeply into every major pillar of the Iranian state. The office of Supreme Leader in the Islamic Republic is constitutionally powerful, but power in practice depends on networks. Khomeini understood early on that survival required more than formal authority. It required control over institutions that shape security, economy, ideology, and information. Among these institutions, none has been more crucial than the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, commonly known as the IRGC. The IRGC was formed after the ARGC was formed after the 1979 revolution to protect the Islamic system from internal and external threats. Over time, it evolved far beyond a conventional military force. It developed ground, naval, and aerospace branches, as well as intelligence units and foreign operations capabilities. Its elite Quds force manages relationships with allied groups across the Middle East. Under Khamenei's leadership, the IRGC became not only a security pillar but also an economic powerhouse, controlling large segments of construction, telecommunications, energy, and infrastructure sectors. This relationship between Khomeini and the Revolutionary Guard is central to understanding modern Iran. While Iran has an elected president and parliament, real power balances are shaped by alignment with the supreme leader and the Guard. Presidents who challenged this balance found themselves constrained. Presidents who aligned closely were empowered. The supreme leader appoints key military commanders, including the head of the IRGC, ensuring loyalty at the highest levels. The IRGC's expansion coincided with regional upheaval. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 removed one of Iran's fiercest enemies and created a power vacuum. Iranian-backed political and militia networks gained influence in Baghdad. In Lebanon, support for Hezbollah deepened, strengthening Iran's deterrence posture against Israel. When civil war erupted in Syria, Iran intervened decisively to preserve the government of Bashar al-Assad. These moves expanded Iran's regional reach, but also intensified confrontation with rivals and Western powers. The United States labeled the IRGC a terrorist organization. Escalating tensions between Washington and Tehran. For Khomeini, such actions reinforced a worldview shaped by decades of confrontation. Since the 1979 revolution and the hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, relations between Iran and the United States have remained adversarial. Sanctions became a permanent feature of Iran's economic environment. Oil exports were restricted. Financial institutions were cut off from global systems. The pressure aimed to limit Iran's regional activities and nuclear program. But it also strengthened hardline narratives within the country that framed resistance as national defense. The nuclear issue became one of the defining chapters of Khomeini's leadership. Negotiations leading to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action were complex and politically sensitive inside Iran. While President Hassan Rouhani's administration led talks, ultimate authority rested with Khomeini. He allowed negotiations to proceed, but maintained skepticism toward Western intentions. When the United States withdrew from the agreement in 2018 and reimposed sanctions, hardliners argued that their distrust had been justified. Iran gradually reduced compliance with the deal's restrictions, bringing nuclear tensions back to the forefront of international diplomacy. Internally, Khomeini's leadership has been tested repeatedly by waves of protest. The 2009 Green Movement followed disputed presidential election results and brought millions into the streets. The protests were eventually suppressed, but they revealed generational and ideological divisions within Iranian society. More recent protests have centered on economic hardship and social freedoms, including women's rights. Each episode has been framed by state media as influenced by foreign interference. While critics argue that domestic grievances are deeply rooted in economic inequality and political restrictions, Iran's economy under sanctions has faced high inflation, currency devaluation, and limited foreign investment. The concept of a resistance economy, promoted by Khomeini, emphasizes self-reliance, domestic production, and reduced vulnerability to external shocks. Supporters argue that despite pressure, the system has survived and maintained strategic independence. Critics contend that isolation has limited growth opportunities, particularly for a young and educated population seeking global integration. The structure of governance under Khomeini blends religious authority with state bureaucracy. The Guardian Council, half of whose members are appointed directly or indirectly by the supreme leader, reviews legislation and approves candidates for elections. This oversight ensures ideological alignment, but narrows political competition. The judiciary, appointed by the supreme leader, plays a significant role in enforcing political boundaries. State broadcasting remains under direct control of his office, shaping national narratives. Yet Khomeini's leadership cannot be reduced solely to coercive power. He has cultivated an image of ideological consistency, frequently delivering speeches on Islamic governance, cultural independence, and resistance to what he describes as Western moral decline. His messaging appeals to segments of society that view the revolution as a safeguard against foreign domination. In a region marked by instability, the Islamic Republic has maintained territorial integrity and institutional continuity for over 4 decades, a fact often highlighted by supporters as he advances in age. The question of succession becomes increasingly important. The Assembly of Experts, an elected clerical body, is constitutionally responsible for selecting the next supreme leader. However, the political dynamics surrounding succession are complex. Potential candidates must possess both religious credentials and political acceptability to the power centers that define the system, including the Revolutionary Guard. A transition could either reinforce continuity or open internal competition among factions. Externally, Iran's future will depend heavily on regional and global developments. The rivalry with Saudi Arabia has fluctuated between confrontation and cautious diplomacy. Recent attempts at normalization signal pragmatic recognition of shared regional interests. Relations with China and Russia have expanded, particularly as Tehran seeks alternatives to Western-dominated financial systems. However, reliance on non-Western partnerships does not eliminate economic challenges, especially if energy markets fluctuate or geopolitical alignments shift. The global implications of leadership change in Tehran are significant. Iran sits atop vast energy reserves and controls strategic geography near the Strait of Hormuz, through which a substantial portion of global oil shipments passes. Any instability within Iran could disrupt energy markets and intensify regional insecurity. Conversely, gradual reform or recalibration of foreign policy could alter the balance of power across the Middle East. Khomeini's legacy will ultimately be debated. To his supporters, he preserved the Islamic Republic against external aggression and internal fragmentation, expanded Iran's regional influence, and defended national sovereignty under intense pressure. To critics, he centralized authority, constrained political pluralism, and presided over economic hardship compounded by isolation. International observers view him as a central architect of Iran's strategic posture, a leader whose cautious but firm approach has shaped decades of Middle Eastern geopolitics. History often judges leaders not only by the crises they face but by the institutions they leave behind. Under Khomeini, Iran's power structure has become highly institutionalized, with overlapping networks of clerical oversight, military influence, and bureaucratic administration. Whether this structure proves adaptable in a rapidly changing global environment remains to be seen, as the world watches Iran's next chapter. One reality is clear: Ayatollah Ali Khomeini has been one of the most consequential political figures in the Middle East since the late 20th century. His decisions influenced wars and negotiations, sanctions and alliances, protest movements, and policy reforms. His leadership spanned the end of the Cold War, the rise of U.S. unipolar dominance, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Arab Spring, and the emerging multipolar order shaped by China and Russia. The documentary of his life is not merely the biography of a cleric turned head of state. It is the story of revolution, institutionalized ideology tested by modern pressures, and power maintained in an era of relentless change. The next chapter, succession, reform, or further entrenchment, will determine whether the system he shaped continues along the same path or enters a new phase entirely.